Let's build an HTML form together. Now, forms are really interesting because it's our first taste of front-end, back-end communication. On the front end in HTML, we actually build the form itself, the thing that users interact with to provide their information and data. And then when a user presses the submit button, all that information gets bundled up and sent to the back end so we can save it or process it or do whatever we need to with it. Now let's come here to Figma to kind of see this in action a little bit more. So we've got our sign up form here. And the way this would work is we're going to code out the form itself, the structure, all that content in HTML. And then when a user presses that button, that would then get sent to a backend, and we would create an account for the user and then authenticate them into our system so that way they could access their information. Now that backend piece, a little beyond what we're going to cover in this course, right now we're going to focus on, okay, how do we actually write the structure for this form? So hopping over to VS Code now, we have our sign up page, and I'll scoot this over so we can see it a little better. And we're a lot of the way there. We have our navigation already. We have our H1, and we said sign up before, but that should be create your account. So why don't we fix that? So we'll say create your account. All right, now we're cooking. So this should all be review so far. Now we're going to get into the form stuff. So with forms, the first thing that we're going to want to do is add, you probably guessed it, a form element. And that's going to be our container for everything that happens inside of the form. So the thing to realize with forms, though, is what we want to be encapsulating are the inputs and then the action or the button that submits that input. So this is what's going to be inside of it. All the stuff inside of here, we don't have to include the nice pretty card or the title or anything like that. So we'll go ahead, fingers on keyboards, follow along. We'll say form here, and that will have a closing tag. Now the form gets two special attributes that we want to make sure we include with it. It's going to get an action, and this defines what happens when the form gets submitted. Usually this is a link to some sort of script or path on the back end where the information is going to get sent to. And then the other important attribute that we want to include is the method. And that defines how we're going to set this information. And that can be either a post or a get. In our case, we're going to do a post. Again, this is getting a little bit beyond HTML, but it's basically saying that we want to send the information to wherever the action is. In our case, we're going to leave action blank right now, but when we get into back-end, front-end communication, we would come back here and fill that out with where we want to send the information. So this is our form. And typically, when you're working with a front-end developer and a back-end developer, this is where you're going to see the most collaboration. They're going to be working together to say, okay, what needs to be happening with these form attributes? So now we've got our form. Let's go ahead and start putting the other information inside of it. So looking at our first field here, we've got name, and then we have a text box, right, or an input. So typically when we're writing our fields like this, there are two elements that we need in order to communicate this. First, we're going to have a label. So fingers on keyboards, let's write it out. We'll say label, and this will say name. And then below that, we can go ahead and we'll write our input. And this will be a self-closing tag. So if we go over here to our code now, and we give this a refresh, notice we have name, and then we have a field, right? And we can type whatever we want in here. Hopefully your name. So this is the beginning of our form here. Now, this is going to require a couple of more attributes here to just add a little bit more kind of semantic linking between these two things, and also to make our input a little bit more useful for us as we start going here. So with the first thing we're going to do is notice how if you select name, or if you try to click on name, it doesn't do anything. Typically, what we want to have happen here, and this is for accessibility reasons, but also for like power users as well, is if you select name, we should pre-fill and select this field here so you can start using it. And so what we want to do is we want to link the label with the input. So we say, what is this label for? So it's important for semantic purposes, important for accessibility, and then some usability as well. So what we want to do here on the label is add an attribute, and we'll say for, and why don't we just say name, right? That'll be the kind of unique identifier for this field. And then on our input, we can add an attribute called ID. And this is the unique identifier and we'll say name here. And now, if we give this a refresh, notice what happens. If we click name, we select the input that's associated with this. So what we're doing here is if you just have a label and you just have an input and they don't have for or ID, they're not associated. Even if they're sitting right next to each other, they're just not related to one another. And so this is our way of explicitly telling the browser, giving it those instructions to say, this label should be associated with this input. So really, really important here as we get rolling. The other thing that we're going to do on our input is we're going to add a type. And this allows us to define what type of information we expect to receive here. This is pretty easy because it's just going to be text, and that's what it is by default. So we'll just say text in here. But there are lots of other inputs that we can add, as we'll see in a few moments. So really important for us to have that in here as well. The last one that we typically add is a name on this attribute as well. And we'll just call this name. It's a little redundant here. But what this is saying is what should we describe this data when we send it to the backend? So this is sort of a way for the backend to understand what exactly this input means. Because if a user comes in over here and they just type a bunch of strings and you're like, how does this, how am I supposed to interpret this? The name is the label for the backend to understand what information is being provided. So altogether, this kind of forms our field. Now, looking back at our design here, we're going to have a couple of fields and some text and a button. So it would be nice if we could sort of logically group this like we would in Figma. If we look at one of these here, yeah, this is an element and it's probably a frame with some auto layout on it. So why don't we do that over here? Well, there's not like a really good semantic thing to say like this is a field. So in this case, a div would be a really appropriate element for containing these related entities with. So why don't we go ahead here? We'll say div, and then we can move these two elements inside of it. So we'll say Command X and Command V. Nice. And now we can do this again for our email and our password. So to speed things up a little bit, why don't we go ahead and we'll just copy this and we'll just paste it twice. Alrighty. So what are we going to change for our email? Well, first the label, obviously, we want that to say email. Great. And what about name for an ID? Yeah, we don't want that to be name. We want it to be email. So we'll change that there. And we'll change it here. And we'll also change it here. Now look at this type. This is something we also want to change because the type of information we're putting into the input is different as well. And this is a really great little input, and we can say it is an email input. So that way we get some additional validation logic when we submit it. And we also get a little bit more of a friendly experience as well. So give this a refresh here, and we can see all of our fields now, but nothing really different here in terms of the presentation. But when we go to submit it, it's actually going to check to see that it matches a format like this, which is really, really helpful for us because now we don't have to do that logic and checking ourselves. The browser can take care of it for us. So it's enforcing that it follows the email format. What's next? We had a password, right? So let's go ahead and look at that one. We're going to do the same thing again. We'll say password, and we'll change these three to password as well. So one, and let's copy, paste, speed it up a little bit. Okay, and we've got type again. Well, hopefully there's a password type, and there sure is. So we can go ahead and say password in here as well. Now this is going to be a little bit more interactive for us. Notice how we type in. We got that little obfuscation there. We can't see exactly what our password is. Super helpful from a security standpoint. Make sure no one's looking over the shoulder and stealing your password. So we have different types of inputs as well. And you're probably familiar with them in your design careers as well. You can have selects, you can have checkboxes, you can have radio boxes, you can have colors and date times and all sorts of different options there. If you're ever confused, you can just Google really easily list of form elements in HTML, and you can get a list there. W3 Schools and the MDM or Mozilla Developer Network are going to be your best resources there. Pretty trustworthy, and they're going to have up-to-date lists. But as you can see, there's lots of different types of inputs you can add. It just takes a little bit of practice. What I like to do when I'm learning new HTML elements is I let the design drive my learning. So I'll design something and I'll say, I'm not sure if I can develop it that way. Or I'll look at something like this where I have colors in my input or select, and I'll say, I'm not quite sure how to do that. Let me go Google around and see if I can find a way to do that. So let your designs drive some of your learning here. You'll find you'll learn things faster, and it's a pretty good way to learn. So we're almost done with this form here, though. What are we going to do next? We're going to have a paragraph here. Why don't we go ahead and do that and include all this information? And then we're going to have some links inside of it. We haven't done that yet, so let's check it out. We'll start with a paragraph, and we'll say all this. Why don't we just copy this? By creating an account, you agree to our private policy, all that good stuff that the legal team wants us to have. So now we've got this paragraph, but if we give this a refresh, right, we don't have any links in here. We haven't provided that markup in our code yet. So what we can do is we can come inside of the paragraph and nest this. So we'll just go ahead and wrap this around in the right spot. Perfect. And we'll do the same thing over here. And obviously you would want to link to a page or a URL in our href. So we'll go ahead and we'll do that next. And we'll say href. And in our case, we don't really have a page for it yet, so we'll leave it blank. So href, great. But now we give it a refresh and we can see we have those links inside of it. So this is really powerful. We have this idea of inside of certain text fields, or certain text elements, I should say, we have the ability to nest other elements. And so this behaves a little bit differently than the nesting we've seen already. Notice here we have that image and that kind of gets its own block and that indentation, versus here when it's a text string like this, we do things a little bit more inline. So keep that idea in mind, that inline information, inline markup is going to be really helpful when you get into CSS. And last but not least, we need our button. So we say create account here. We're going to need to make sure that we do that at the bottom here. So we'll say button, and we'll say create account. So buttons are a new one as well. We've only been working with links so far, but as you see, we give that a refresh and it generates a button. Not as nice as the one we want, but we can style that later. Now we have a button here. And if we were to click on this and it was wired up to the back end, it would actually try to send this to the back end, and we would have all sorts of good stuff happening there. So we'd be creating an account, and then we'd be authenticated as well. So this is it. This is the typical structure for this. Obviously, we need to add some CSS to make it look a little bit nicer, but in terms of the core content, the structure, this is all we need from an HTML perspective. So I'd really encourage y'all, again, as you're designing, say, what kind of input is that? Or as you're designing something maybe a little bit more advanced, something like really interactive toggles or sliders or things of that nature, anything where you're collecting user input, just go on Google and say, how would I represent this as an HTML element? And when you're going and talking to your developers, that's going to be a really productive conversation. You could say, oh, this should be type email or type color or type date time. And they're going to immediately be like, I know exactly what you're talking about. Thank you. And so this is, again, a really great way for us to bridge that gap between design and development. But if you have any questions along the way, feel free to drop them in the comments. Happy to answer them.